50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
In his speech, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. criticized the U.S. government's failure to provide equal political rights for African Americans by highlighting the severity of the injustices and unfair treatment they faced. At the time, racism was an increasingly worrying problem, especially in southern cities like Birmingham, Alabama, where Jim Crow laws were in full effect and hate crimes in the form of bombings were extremely common. Although the civil rights movement lacked support in Birmingham, MLK devised a plan that would expose the cruelty and racial prejudice of the Birmingham police and gain national attention. In 1963, MLK, along with James Bevel, another civil rights activist, led the controversial and nonviolent Children's March comprised of African American students and were attacked by the Birmingham police via dogs and water hoses. In the same year, at the March on Washington, MLK used the aftermath of the Children's March as a foundation of his argument in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech that gained the attention of U.S. President Lyndon Johnson, who sympathized with the movement. A year later, Johnson established the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Therefore, through his actions, MLK helped to secure more political rights for African Americans and listened